You've been taught that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth means justice through revenge. Churches have preached it as divine law for centuries. Society built entire legal systems on this interpretation. Governments justified wars with this principle. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something that will shatter everything you believed about this ancient teaching, and what he found changes not just biblical understanding, but your power to live free from attack. What if I told you this phrase was never about punishment at all? What if it was actually a mystical instruction for spiritual protection that organized religion deliberately misunderstood for 2,000 years? The truth has been hidden in plain sight, encoded in Scripture, waiting for consciousness advanced enough to recognize it. Today you're about to discover what it really means and how it can transform every conflict in your life. This isn't just biblical interpretation or theological debate. This is a consciousness technique that can transform how you respond to every attack, insult, betrayal, or injustice in your life. Joel Goldsmith called it the principle of impersonalization, and it's one of the most powerful spiritual secrets ever taught. Masters have used this for centuries to remain untouchable by human malice while living in the midst of conflict and chaos. When you understand what eye for an eye truly means, you gain access to a level of spiritual immunity that nothing external can penetrate. You stop being a victim of other people's consciousness and become a master of your own experience. You discover that the ancient teaching wasn't about what others do to you, but about what consciousness you hold within yourself. Let me take you back to the moment when Joel Goldsmith first penetrated this mystery. He was deep in meditation, studying ancient Hebrew texts, when he realized something that made him sit up in shock. The original context of eye for an eye wasn't about literal retaliation at all. It was about spiritual equivalent and the immutable law of consciousness that governs all human experience. In mystical Hebrew tradition, which the rabbis understood but rarely taught publicly, the eye represents spiritual perception and consciousness. The tooth represents the power to consume, to take in, to make something part of your experience. So eye for an eye really means perception for perception, consciousness for consciousness returning to itself. It's describing how reality operates as a perfect mirror, reflecting back exactly what we project from the depths of our consciousness. When someone attacks you, criticizes you, betrays you, or seeks to harm you, they're actually revealing their own consciousness level to you. They're showing you their inner world, their spiritual state, their level of understanding. Joel taught that grasping this single truth changes everything because you immediately stop taking attacks personally and start seeing them as impersonal manifestations of human consciousness operating at whatever level that person has attained. This shift from personal to impersonal is the key that unlocks spiritual immunity. When you see an attack as personal, aimed specifically at you because of who you are, you absorb the poison. You carry the wound. You react from pain and create more conflict. But when you see the attack as impersonal consciousness expressing itself through that particular person, something miraculous happens that Joel proved thousands of times in his healing practice. Here's where the teaching becomes revolutionary and practical. Joel Goldsmith taught that when you truly understand eye for an eye as a consciousness principle rather than a revenge doctrine, you gain immunity to harm. Not physical immunity necessarily, though that sometimes occurs, but spiritual immunity that completely changes your entire experience of conflict, attack, and human malice in ways that seem impossible until you experience it yourself. Think carefully about the last time someone criticized you harshly, betrayed your trust, spread lies about you, or treated you with deliberate cruelty. Your natural human response was probably hurt that cut deep, anger that consumed your peace, or the burning desire to retaliate and make them feel what you felt. That's because you personalized the attack completely. You made it about you, about your worth, about whether you deserved such treatment. But Joel discovered through years of spiritual practice and mystical insight that attacks aren't personal at all, even when they appear personal. They're impersonal operations of human consciousness expressing itself at whatever level of spiritual understanding that consciousness has reached. The person attacking you could have attacked anyone. The attack comes from their consciousness state, not from truth about you. When you genuinely see an attack as impersonal consciousness expressing itself, something miraculous occurs that changes your entire experience. The attack loses its power over you instantly. You don't absorb the poison into your being. You don't carry the wound forward into your future. You recognize it as human belief operating through that person, appearing as attack, but having no basis in spiritual reality or truth about your divine identity. This is the secret that literally changes everything about how you experience life. Eye for an eye means you receive back the exact consciousness you hold and entertain. If you hold consciousness of being attacked, vulnerable, and victimized, you will experience attack, vulnerability, and victimization. If you hold consciousness of divine immunity, spiritual protection, and untouchable identity, you will experience protection regardless of what appears to happen in the external world of human drama. Joel Goldsmith didn't just teach this as theory or spiritual philosophy. He proved this principle worked in his own life repeatedly, consistently, demonstrably. When faced with vicious criticism from religious authorities, with competition from jealous practitioners, with actual malice from people who wanted to destroy his work, he would immediately shift into spiritual consciousness and recognize the attack as impersonal human belief operating at that level with absolutely no power in divine reality. The situations would dissolve without him fighting back. The attacks would lose their momentum. The attackers would often apologize later or simply disappear from his experience, not through his human effort or defensive action, but through the operation of spiritual law responding to his consciousness. This is what eye for an eye really describes, the law of consciousness creating equivalent experience. The reason this profound teaching was misunderstood for millennia is embarrassingly simple. The human mind wants revenge desperately. It wants justice through punishment. It wants to see attackers suffer. But spiritual law operates on a completely different principle. It operates through consciousness level, not through human action or reaction. When you change your consciousness, you automatically and inevitably change your experience without doing anything in the external world. Let me share a transformation story that demonstrates this principle with such clarity that you'll never doubt its power again. Sarah was going through the most brutal divorce imaginable. Her ex-husband, consumed by rage and vindictiveness, was lying systematically in court proceedings, turning their children against her with calculated manipulation, spreading vicious rumors throughout their community, and using his greater financial resources to destroy her. She was consumed with rage that burned through her day and night. The desire for revenge obsessed her thoughts. She fantasized about exposing his lies, destroying his reputation, making him pay for every moment of suffering he caused. She could barely eat or sleep. Her health was deteriorating. Her remaining relationships were suffering because she could talk about nothing but his attacks. When Sarah discovered Joel Goldsmith's teaching on impersonalization through a friend's recommendation, she was deeply skeptical. How could seeing attacks as impersonal possibly help when someone was actively, deliberately, personally destroying your life? It seemed like spiritual bypass, like denial of reality, like foolish passivity in the face of real evil. But she was desperate enough to try the practice Joel recommended. Every single time she felt attacked, which was dozens of times daily, she would pause whatever she was doing and say internally with as much conviction as she could muster, "This is not personal. This is human consciousness operating at this level of fear and pain. This has no power in divine reality. I refuse to accept this into my consciousness." For 3 weeks of faithful practice, nothing seemed to change in the external situation. The attacks continued relentlessly. The legal battles intensified. But something profound was shifting inside her consciousness. By week 4, Sarah noticed something remarkable. She wasn't carrying the emotional poison anymore. She could think about her ex-husband's actions without rage instantly consuming her peace. She could hear about new attacks without her body flooding with stress hormones. She was observing the drama rather than being destroyed by it. Her sleep improved. Her appetite returned. Friends commented that she seemed different, lighter, more herself. Then something completely unexpected happened in the external situation. Her ex-husband's lawyer called her lawyer, requesting mediation rather than continued litigation. In the mediation session, her ex-husband seemed different, less aggressive, almost confused about his own behavior. Within 2 months, they reached a settlement that was remarkably fair, given how the case had been proceeding. Sarah later learned from mutual friends that her ex-husband had told people he didn't know why he'd been so vicious. He said something had shifted and he couldn't maintain the rage anymore. Sarah understood what Joel taught. Her consciousness shift had changed the entire energy field of the situation. When she stopped empowering the attack by fighting it from wounded consciousness, divine law could operate and resolve what human effort could never fix. This wasn't coincidence or lucky timing. This was consciousness law operating as reliably as gravity. Eye for an eye had played out perfectly. Sarah's consciousness of being attacked had created experience of attack. When she shifted to consciousness of spiritual immunity, the attack lost its power and the situation transformed. Joel had proven this pattern thousands of times in 40 years of teaching and healing work. Another profoundly powerful example comes from Marcus, a successful business owner whose trusted partner of 15 years embezzled over $200,000 and disappeared completely, leaving the business on the verge of bankruptcy. Marcus was financially devastated, legally advised that recovery was unlikely, and emotionally destroyed by the betrayal from someone he'd considered family. His anger was literally eating him alive. He couldn't focus on saving his business because rage consumed his thoughts day and night. His blood pressure skyrocketed. He developed stress-related health problems. His remaining employees were worried about him. His family didn't know how to help. He was trapped in consciousness of betrayal, victimization, and righteous fury that felt completely justified, but was destroying him faster than the financial loss. Marcus began practicing Joel's principle of impersonalization with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Every morning before even getting out of bed, he would spend 30 minutes in meditation recognizing the impersonal nature of greed, dishonesty, and betrayal. He worked to see his former partner not as personally against him, but as operating from a consciousness of lack and fear so powerful that theft seemed necessary for survival. This practice didn't excuse the crime legally or morally. Marcus still pursued every legal avenue available, but it freed him completely from the spiritual poison of hatred that was killing him. Within 6 weeks of daily practice, Marcus reported feeling genuine peace for the first time since the betrayal. His blood pressure normalized. His focus returned. His business began recovering because he could think clearly again. His creativity came back. Then, 8 months after beginning the impersonalization practice, something extraordinary occurred. Authorities in another state contacted Marcus. His former partner had been located through an unrelated investigation, and significant assets were being recovered. The legal process would take time, but Marcus would recover most of his losses. But here's what Marcus told Joel directly. He didn't even care that much about the money by that point. The real recovery had already happened in his consciousness. He'd been freed from the prison of hatred and victimization. He'd discovered that his peace didn't depend on external justice. He'd learned that consciousness is the only thing that truly matters, because consciousness creates experience. Joel would say this wasn't magic or mysticism in the sense of supernatural intervention. This was consciousness law operating as precisely and reliably as any physical law. When you stop empowering human evil by fighting it from the level of human consciousness, divine law has space to operate. When you impersonalize, you remove yourself from the battlefield of human conflict and let spiritual principle handle what human effort cannot resolve. Marcus's experience demonstrates what eye for an eye really means in practical application. His consciousness of being betrayed created the experience of betrayal consuming his life. When he shifted to consciousness of spiritual immunity and impersonal recognition, his experience transformed even before the external situation resolved. The consciousness shift was the real healing. The money recovery was just confirmation that spiritual law operates in practical affairs. If these real transformation stories inspire you to discover more of Joel Goldsmith's hidden teachings that actually work in daily life, like this video to help others find this wisdom. Subscribe for more consciousness principles with practical applications, and comment which story resonated most powerfully with your current situation or challenges. Jennifer's story reveals how this principle works with ongoing daily attacks that seem endless. She worked in a toxic corporate environment with a supervisor who seemed personally determined to destroy her career through systematic harassment. Constant public criticism in meetings, deliberate humiliation in front of clients, blocked promotions despite excellent performance, and carefully documented false accusations designed to build a termination case. Human resources was completely unhelpful. essentially telling Jennifer to deal with it or leave. The job market made leaving difficult. Jennifer felt trapped in a nightmare of daily attacks that were grinding down her spirit, her confidence, and her mental health. She would drive to work with her stomach in knots, spend the entire day in fight-or-flight mode, and come home emotionally exhausted. Joel Goldsmith's teaching on impersonalization gave Jennifer a completely different approach to her situation. Instead of continuing to defend herself legally, plot revenge fantasies, or sink into victimhood and depression, she began to practice seeing her supervisor as a soul struggling with deep insecurity and fear, rather than as a personal enemy determined to destroy her specifically. She practiced recognizing that the attacks were not about Jennifer's worth, competence, or value as a human being. They were about her supervisor's consciousness state, probably driven by feeling threatened by Jennifer's competence, struggling with personal problems Jennifer knew nothing about, and operating from a level of consciousness that produces attacking behavior. The attacks were impersonal consciousness expressing itself, not truth about Jennifer. Jennifer committed to spending 10 minutes every single morning before work, establishing her consciousness firmly in spiritual truth. She would sit in her car in the parking lot and practice recognizing that she was divinely protected, that human malice had no power in spiritual reality, that her true identity was untouchable by human belief or behavior, and that this situation was an opportunity to prove consciousness principle rather than a victimization. She stopped reacting emotionally to attacks, which initially confused her supervisor and eventually began to defuse the dynamic. When criticized in meetings, Jennifer would pause internally, recognize it as impersonal consciousness, refuse to absorb the poison, and respond calmly from facts rather than defensiveness. Her supervisor seemed confused that the attacks weren't landing as before. Within 3 months of consistent practice, something shifted dramatically. Her supervisor was abruptly transferred to another department as part of a reorganization. Jennifer was promoted to a position she'd been denied repeatedly. The new supervisor was collaborative and supportive. Jennifer later learned through office gossip that her former supervisor was dealing with severe personal issues, including divorce and financial problems that had nothing to do with Jennifer. The attacks had always been impersonal projections of pain and fear, exactly as Joel taught. Jennifer's supervisor had been attacking life itself through attacking Jennifer. When Jennifer stopped accepting the attacks into her consciousness, stopped empowering them with her emotional reaction, the entire dynamic collapsed because it takes two consciousnesses to maintain a conflict. When one consciousness shifts to impersonalization, conflict cannot continue. These 3 detailed stories reveal something profound that you need to grasp completely. When you understand eye for an eye as consciousness principle rather than revenge instruction, you gain access to a level of spiritual protection and immunity that human effort cannot provide through any amount of self-defense, legal action, or counterattack. You stop being a victim of circumstances and become a conscious participant in spiritual law. Joel Goldsmith spent 4 decades proving this principle worked consistently across thousands of cases. Not sometimes randomly, not occasionally when conditions were right, but as reliable spiritual law that operates as precisely as mathematical principle. The key is understanding with your entire being that attacks are always impersonal operations of human consciousness at whatever level, and your only real work is maintaining your own consciousness at the level of spiritual truth. This doesn't mean you don't take practical action when needed and appropriate. You absolutely still use legal systems when crimes occur. You set firm boundaries with toxic people. You protect yourself physically when threatened. But you take these practical actions from a consciousness of spiritual immunity rather than from fear, hatred, or victimization. That internal shift changes everything about the effectiveness of your actions. When you act from wounded consciousness, your actions are contaminated by the poison you've absorbed. They're driven by reaction rather than wisdom. They often escalate conflict or create new problems. But when you act from clear consciousness that has impersonalized the attack, your actions are guided by divine wisdom. They're effective because they're not distorted by emotional poison. You respond rather than react, and that difference is everything. Now let me teach you the specific technique Joel Goldsmith used for impersonalization in exact detail. This isn't vague theory or general spiritual philosophy. This is the actual practice that protected him and thousands of his students from psychological harm, emotional devastation, and spiritual poison. The technique has 3 essential steps that must be practiced exactly as Joel taught them for maximum effectiveness. Step 1 is immediate recognition, the instant you become aware of feeling attacked. The very moment you feel attacked, criticized, betrayed, insulted, or harmed in any way, you pause whatever you're doing and say internally with full attention, "This is not personal to me. This is impersonal human consciousness expressing itself at this level." You're not denying the attack happened in the human scene. You're correctly identifying its true nature and source. Step 2 is conscious refusal to absorb the poison being offered. You deliberately and consciously refuse to take the attack into your consciousness as truth about yourself. You recognize that the other person is essentially offering you their consciousness state, their pain, their fear, their limited perception, and you have the spiritual power to decline the offer completely. Joel would say firmly, "I will not accept this into my consciousness. It has no power in spiritual reality." Step 3 is establishing divine truth about your identity and experience. You consciously affirm your true identity as spiritual consciousness, eternally untouchable by human belief, opinion, or malice. You rest in the awareness that nothing external has power to harm your true being or determine your experience. This isn't positive thinking or affirmation trying to change reality. This is recognition of spiritual fact that's always true regardless of appearances. Joel taught a complementary practice he called the principle of one power that enhances impersonalization by addressing the fundamental root of why attacks seem powerful in the first place. We've been conditioned to believe in 2 powers operating in the universe: good and evil, God and devil, forces attacking us and forces defending us. But spiritual reality knows only one power, and grasping this transforms everything. When you encounter any attack of any kind, immediately recognize with your full understanding that evil has no actual power because only one power exists in reality. The appearance of attack is human consciousness misperceiving reality, exactly like mistaking a rope for a snake in dim light. The snake never existed as a real threat. Only the misperception had power to create fear, but the fear was based on illusion, not reality. Practice establishing one power consciousness daily, not just during attacks. Every single morning as part of your spiritual practice, establish firmly in consciousness that only divine power operates in your experience. Human malice, disease, lack, limitation, and fear are not secondary powers fighting against good. They're illusions, misperceptions, beliefs that dissolve completely when consciousness recognizes that only one power exists. Joel proved this principle of one power repeatedly in his healing work with so-called incurable diseases. Medical conditions that seemed overwhelmingly powerful, diseases that appeared unstoppable and terminal, would dissolve when consciousness firmly established the truth of one power operating. The same exact principle applies to human attacks. They're not real power opposing you. They're misperception appearing as power but having no substance in reality. Another crucial technique Joel taught is what he called witness consciousness. This practice trains you to observe human drama without becoming entangled in it, without identifying with the character being attacked. When attacks happen, you consciously step back mentally and watch the entire situation from a higher perspective, like watching a movie rather than being the actor on screen getting attacked. From witness consciousness, you see the complete picture with clarity. You see the attacker's pain and fear driving their behavior. You see your own habitual reactions and patterns. You see the impersonal nature of human consciousness playing out its dramas according to the level of understanding present. This perspective naturally creates immunity because you're no longer identified with the small self that can be attacked. Practice this witness consciousness throughout your day with small irritations first to build the capacity. When someone cuts you off in traffic, witness the irritation arising in your consciousness without becoming the irritation, without identifying with it. When someone speaks rudely in a store, witness the reaction without being consumed by it. Build this witness capacity gradually with minor situations. When major attacks come, you'll have developed the spiritual muscle to immediately shift into witness consciousness automatically. The attack still happens in the human scene where bodies and personalities interact, but you're observing from spiritual consciousness, from your true identity that cannot be touched. From that elevated space, Divine wisdom can guide your response, rather than human reaction controlling you. Joel's final complementary technique is blessing the attacker, which sounds completely impossible when you're hurt, but is scientifically powerful for shifting your own consciousness instantly. You're not blessing the attack itself or condoning the behavior. You're blessing the person's true spiritual identity that exists beyond their current limited consciousness level and the actions it produces. The practice is simple in form, but profound in effect. When someone attacks you, after you've impersonalized and established one power and shifted to witness consciousness, you then silently bless them with genuine intention. You say internally, "Father, bless this person's true spiritual nature. Reveal to them their divine identity. Free them from the consciousness of fear and pain that drives this attacking behavior." This practice isn't primarily for their benefit, though it may help them eventually. It's for your consciousness immediately. The moment you genuinely bless an attacker from your heart, you cannot simultaneously hate them or hold poison toward them. You cannot maintain cursing consciousness while blessing. Your consciousness automatically shifts to a higher level, where the attack cannot touch you because blessing and being wounded cannot coexist. Joel taught clearly that blessing doesn't mean allowing abuse to continue or being passive toward injustice. You still set necessary boundaries firmly. You take legal action if warranted. You remove yourself from toxic situations. But you do all these practical things from a blessed consciousness rather than a cursed consciousness. That internal difference changes your entire experience and very often transforms outcomes in ways human effort alone cannot achieve. Now let's address honestly the real challenges you'll face when practicing this principle in your actual life. The biggest obstacle by far is the human mind's absolute conviction, supported by a lifetime of conditioning, that attacks are personal. Your ego will insist ferociously that this attack is about you specifically, aimed at you deliberately, designed to hurt you personally because of who you are or what you've done. That belief that attacks are personal is actually the poison itself, not the attack. The attack is just words, actions, or circumstances in the external world. The poison is your consciousness personalizing it, taking it in, making it truth about yourself, carrying it forward into your future. When you first try to impersonalize an attack, your mind will rebel with tremendous force. Your mind will produce 1,000 apparently logical reasons why this situation is different from all others, why this attack really is personal unlike other attacks, why the technique won't work here even if it worked elsewhere. Joel warned his students explicitly about this resistance. He called it the human mind's fierce resistance to spiritual law, because the ego survives through personalizing everything. The practice requires patient repetition and commitment. The first 20 or 30 times you attempt to impersonalize attacks, it will probably feel fake, mechanical, ineffective. Your emotions will still be triggered instantly. You'll still feel hurt or angry or afraid. This is completely normal and expected. You're retraining consciousness that's been conditioned for decades, possibly lifetimes, to personalize absolutely everything that happens. Joel strongly advised his students to practice impersonalization on small irritations first rather than waiting for major betrayals. Don't make your first attempt at this technique the moment you discover your spouse's affair or your business partner's embezzlement. Practice on daily annoyances, minor criticisms, small slights, traffic incidents, rude store clerks. Build the consciousness muscle gradually so it's genuinely strong when serious attacks come. Another major challenge people face is the fear that impersonalization means becoming passive, becoming a doormat, allowing abuse to continue without response. People worry that if they stop taking attacks personally, they'll become weak and ineffective. This completely misunderstands the principle and what Joel actually taught. Impersonalization actually empowers you to respond far more effectively than personalization does. When you personalize attacks, you react from wounded ego consciousness. Your responses are driven by hurt, anger, fear, shame, or the desperate need to defend yourself and prove your worth. These emotional reactions are rarely wise or effective. They often escalate conflict dramatically or create entirely new problems. You're fighting from a consciousness of being attacked, which means you've already lost. When you impersonalize completely, you respond from spiritual wisdom rather than human reaction. You see the situation with clarity undistorted by emotional poison. You can take strong action if needed. You can set firm boundaries. You can use legal systems. You can walk away entirely. But you do everything from power and clarity rather than from woundedness. Your actions are effective because they're not contaminated by absorbed poison. The challenge of ongoing, persistent attacks requires special attention and advanced practice. What do you do when impersonalization seems to work momentarily, but attacks continue relentlessly? When a toxic family member, co-worker, neighbor, or situation persists despite your faithful consciousness work? Joel had very specific guidance for this scenario that many students face. First, recognize clearly that your work isn't to change the attacker or stop the attacks through your consciousness. Your work is solely to maintain your own consciousness at the level of spiritual truth, regardless of what's happening externally. The attacks might continue in the external human scene while your internal experience transforms completely. That's still absolute success in spiritual terms. Second, understand that persistence of attacks often means you're being called to deeper, more committed practice. You might be impersonalizing intellectually, saying the right words, but still carrying emotional charge underneath. Joel would say, go deeper into the practice. Practice longer periods. Be more vigilant about the consciousness you're entertaining during the day when not in formal practice. Third, honestly, examine if you need to take practical action you've been avoiding. Impersonalization isn't a substitute for setting necessary boundaries, leaving genuinely toxic situations, or using legal protection when warranted. Spiritual principle and practical action work together harmoniously. Sometimes the divine guidance that comes through clear consciousness is to physically remove yourself from the situation entirely. Let me share the breakthrough moment that usually comes after several weeks of faithful daily practice. You'll notice quite suddenly that attacks don't trigger the same emotional devastation they once did automatically. Someone can say the same hurtful thing that would have destroyed your peace for days before, and you feel surprisingly untouched, almost surprised at your own lack of reaction. This shift isn't numbness or emotional suppression or denial. You still recognize clearly that the attack happened in the human scene. You might still choose to take appropriate action, but the poison doesn't enter your consciousness. The wound doesn't form in your psyche. You observe human consciousness operating at that level without making it your reality or truth about yourself. Joel called this breakthrough moment achieving spiritual immunity, and it's one of the most liberating experiences possible in human life. The breakthrough often comes suddenly after gradual internal work you couldn't see happening. Students report a moment when they realized they'd been attacked significantly but completely forgot to be hurt. They impersonalized automatically without conscious effort. That's when you know the principle has moved from intellectual understanding to actual consciousness demonstration. If these advanced techniques for overcoming spiritual obstacles and achieving immunity speak directly to your heart and need, like this video to support Joel Goldsmith's teachings reaching people who desperately need them. Subscribe for more advanced consciousness practices with detailed instructions, and comment which specific challenge you're personally committed to transforming through impersonalization starting today. Now let's explore advanced application in the most difficult scenarios possible. What about attacks from people you deeply love? Family members who criticize you constantly and cruelly, romantic partners who betray your trust completely, adult children who reject you despite everything you've given them. Joel taught that these are actually the most important situations to practice impersonalization, not the least. When someone you love attacks you, the personalization goes infinitely deeper because you're emotionally attached to their opinion and their love. You desperately want them to see you truly, love you rightly, treat you well. When they don't, when they attack instead, the wound cuts to your very core identity. Joel understood this pain intimately from his own life experience. The practice remains exactly the same, but requires absolutely fierce commitment and repeated application. This person I love is operating from a consciousness level that produces this attacking behavior. It's not about my worth or value. It's not personal truth about me. It's their consciousness state expressing itself according to spiritual law. I refuse to let their consciousness level become my experience or determine my peace. Joel would add something crucial here that changes how you see the practice. When you successfully impersonalize attacks from loved ones, you actually free them from the dynamic. Your refusal to engage at that consciousness level, your refusal to absorb their poison and throw it back, Create space for them to shift if they're capable. Not always, not guaranteed, but often. Your consciousness work removes the energetic dynamic that was sustaining the conflict pattern. Advanced practitioners face another challenging scenario: attacks that seem completely justified by your actual mistakes. What if you genuinely did something wrong? What if the criticism is objectively valid? Joel's answer might surprise you profoundly. Impersonalization applies even when you've made genuine mistakes. Perhaps especially then, because that's when you're most vulnerable to absorbing poison. Valid criticism still doesn't need to be personalized into your consciousness as identity. You can fully acknowledge your error, make appropriate amends, and change your behavior going forward without taking poison into your consciousness. The mistake was an action in time, not your eternal identity. The criticism reveals the other person's response and consciousness, not ultimate truth about your worth as a spiritual being. Joel made a crucial distinction between accepting responsibility and accepting condemnation. You take full responsibility for actions and their consequences. You make repairs where possible. You learn and grow. But you don't accept the consciousness of shame, guilt, unworthiness, or being fundamentally flawed. Those are human additions to simple fact, not spiritual truth about your divine identity. This practice actually makes genuine apology and real change far more possible. When you're not defending a wounded ego or protecting a shaky sense of worth, you can see your errors with clarity and address them effectively. When criticism doesn't threaten your core identity, you can receive the valid information it contains without the poison of condemnation that blocks growth. The most advanced application Joel taught is impersonalizing attacks on your spiritual understanding and practice itself. These are the most dangerous attacks because they're not aimed at your body, emotions, or reputation. They're aimed at undermining the very consciousness work that's been transforming your life and giving you freedom from suffering. When people mock your spiritual beliefs, ridicule your practices as delusion, undermine your spiritual authority, or insist you're wasting your life on fantasy, something deeper is being challenged than surface opinions. These attacks trigger existential fear that maybe you are deluded, maybe you are wasting your time, maybe you're following false teaching that's leading you away from reality. Joel said these spiritual attacks come precisely when you're making genuine progress and something wants desperately to stop it. The attacks reveal that your consciousness shift is threatening to other consciousness levels. People operating from purely material consciousness feel threatened by spiritual consciousness and attack it reflexively. The impersonalization here requires recognizing that attacks on spiritual truth are never about the truth itself, which is eternal and untouchable. Divine reality cannot be attacked by human opinion. Only human consciousness, believing itself separate from God, can feel threatened by spiritual teaching and attack it. The attack reveals the attacker's consciousness level and fear, not truth about spiritual principle or your path. Joel practiced this constantly throughout his ministry. His revolutionary teachings were attacked viciously by traditional religion claiming he was heretical, by materialists insisting he was delusional, by other spiritual teachers feeling competitive. He never defended himself. He never attacked back. He recognized each attack as human consciousness operating at that level, and continued teaching calmly from established spiritual consciousness. The final advanced scenario is collective attack. When groups turn against you, when social media mobs form, when entire communities reject you. This tests impersonalization at the deepest possible level because the sheer overwhelming volume of attack feels crushing and the total isolation feels unbearable. Joel taught that collective attack is still impersonal consciousness, just expressed through multiple channels simultaneously. A million people operating from the same consciousness level doesn't make that consciousness true or powerful. It remains human belief, regardless of how many humans believe it simultaneously. Your work stays exactly the same. Impersonalize, establish one power, witness, and bless. In these intense scenarios, practical action becomes especially crucial. You might need to step completely away from social media, leave communities, reduce public exposure while you stabilize your consciousness in truth. Impersonalization doesn't mean subjecting yourself to ongoing assault. It means not carrying the poison internally while you take wise protective action externally. We've journeyed together from complete misunderstanding of eye for an eye to profound spiritual truth that can revolutionize your entire life. You now understand with clarity that this wasn't a revenge doctrine, but a consciousness principle describing spiritual law. You receive back into your experience the exact consciousness you hold within yourself. Attack consciousness experiences attack. Immune consciousness experiences protection. You've learned Joel Goldsmith's specific techniques in detail. Immediate recognition of all attacks as impersonal consciousness, absolute refusal to absorb poison, establishing spiritual truth firmly, practicing one power principle, developing witness consciousness, and blessing attackers. You've seen real transformation stories proving beyond doubt these principles work consistently when practiced faithfully according to Joel's instructions. You understand the challenges you'll inevitably face and exactly how to overcome them through commitment. You know this isn't passive acceptance of abuse, but empowered response from spiritual consciousness rather than wounded ego. You recognize that your only work is maintaining your consciousness at truth level, regardless of external circumstances, that consciousness will eventually transform. The teaching hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years is now fully revealed to you. Eye for an eye describes the perfect law of consciousness mirroring itself. Tooth for a tooth describes receiving exactly what you project from within. When you understand this completely, you gain power over your experience that nothing external can ever take from you, and you become truly free. If your understanding of this ancient teaching has been completely transformed by Joel Goldsmith's revelation, like this video so more people discover this life-changing wisdom, subscribe for more consciousness principles that create real transformation, and comment, "I am spiritually immune," to declare your commitment to living from this new consciousness level.